So for twinning, there's two different types you need to know. There's dizygotic, which is always non-identical or fraternal twins. It's two eggs fertilized by two separate sperm, and they're genotypically independent entities. And we have our uterus, and we've got two separate implantation sites, and the number of implantation sites equals your number of chorions. So we'd have two chorions, and for each chorion that develops, we'd have an amniotic sac, so we've also got two amnions. So we've got a dichorionic, diamnionic pregnancy for dizygotic twins. Now for monozygotic twins, these are identical twins, one fertilized egg with one sperm. Okay, so they're genotypically identical, and the USMLE really wants you to know how the time of the split of that first zygote relates to how many chorions and amnions we'll have. So let's say we've got our time of split, and we've got our number of chorions, we've got our number of amnions. So let's say our time of split is in the first 0 to 4 days. Okay, so this would occur prior to implantation. Okay, that means we have two separate implantation sites and two chorions respectively, and each chorion would lead to a development of an amnion. So we have a dichorionic, diamnionic pregnancy, same as with our dizygotic twins. Okay, that occurs about 25% of the time. Now about 75% of the time, and this is most common, okay, this is most common about 75% of the time, the split occurs just after implantation, so we only have one chorion, okay, because there's only one implantation site, but it's early enough that there's two separate amniotic sacs that develop. So that occurs about 75% of the time. We have a monochorionic, diamnionic pregnancy. About a smaller percentage of the time, we get the split between 8 to 12 days, where this is well after implantation, so we have one chorion, but the amniotic sacs already developed, so we have a monochorionic, monoamnionic pregnancy. These are actually the pregnancies that are risky, where we can get anastomosis between the fetal vessels, so one fetus might receive more blood supply than the other, leading to developmentally different neonates. So if we get the split after 12 days, we still had that one implantation site with one chorion. We still had our one amnion, except now this is our conjoined twins, so Siamese twins. Okay. For the flash quiz, in the most common form of monozygotic twinning, how many chorions and amnions are there? And it would be a monochorionic diamnionic, because the most common form is between 4 to 8 days following fertilization. So we already have that one implantation site, so that means one chorion, monochorionic, but this occurs before the amniotic sacs develop, so we have two amniotic sacs. So monochorionic, diamnionic about 75% of the time. So we've mentioned the placenta a few times now, but what is it exactly and what does it do? Okay, so the placenta is an organ that regulates nutrient and gas exchange between the mother and the fetus. Okay, so we've got different components of the placenta. The fetus contributes the cytotrophoblast and syncytiotrophoblast, which are the outer layers of the chorionic villi. Okay, so you can see the light blue is the syncytiotrophoblast, cytotrophoblast. And the cytotrophoblast, which are the entities that look like cells in these images, the darker cells in the image, these are kind of stem cells of the placenta, and they differentiate into the syncytiotrophoblast or form more cytotrophoblasts as the placenta grows. Now the syncytiotrophoblast are the lighter layer outside of the trophoblast, and these cells actually invade the uterine wall and secrete human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. Now, as you may remember, HCG is the hormone pregnancy test measure and is secreted beginning at day 6. HCG is necessary during the first trimester for what? Now, HCG maintains the corpus luteum, which secretes progesterone. After the first trimester, the placenta takes over progesterone production, and the corpus luteum degrades into the corpus albicans. The maternal component of the placenta is the decidua bassalis. Now, what is the decidua bassalis derived from? It's the endometrium. Maternal arteries and veins flow through it to supply blood to the placenta. Maternal blood pools in these large spaces called lacunae, which is Latin for little lakes. Okay, there's lacunae here. And this is where gases and nutrients diffuse between the mother and fetus. For blood to get from the placenta to the fetus, it travels through the umbilical cord. As is the case in the pulmonary circulation, the umbilical arteries have deoxygenated blood, and the veins have oxygenated blood. Now remember, the artery-vein naming convention is in reference to the fetal heart, not the mother's heart. There is only one vein, but two arteries. Now the umbilical vein supplies oxygenated blood to the inferior vena cava of the fetus, but the umbilical arteries return deoxygenated blood from the fetal internal iliac. Now, these vessels, the two umbilical arteries and single umbilical vein, are protected and suspended inside a gelatinous substance in the umbilical cord called Wharton's jelly. Now, Wharton's jelly contains stem cells and also has fibroblasts, macrophages, and other mucopolysaccharides such as hyaluronic acid and chondroitin sulfate. But Wharton's jelly is important because it helps protect the two umbilical arteries and single umbilical vein within the umbilical cord. And how is the umbilical cord formed? It starts as an endodermal evagination from the developing hindgut called the allantois, which extends into the urogenital sinus during week 3. A mesodermal connecting stalk surrounds the allantois, and this is the early umbilical cord. The fetal bladder is connected to the allantois through the urachus, and nitrogenous waste is removed through these structures. Blood vessels from within the stalk connect the fetus to the placenta, and the allantois eventually regresses, leaving just the arteries, vein, and urachus in the umbilical cord. Now after birth, the urachus regresses as well, leaving a fibrous remnant known as the medial umbilical ligament. If the urachus remains open, it is known as a patent urachus, and urine continues to be discharged from the umbilicus after birth. It can also form a vesico-urachal diverticulum, which is an outpouching of the bladder, if it is mostly obliterated but the most proximal portion remains open. The USMLE is obsessed with you knowing that the umbilical arteries regress into the medial umbilical ligaments, and that the allantois/urachus regresses into the median umbilical ligament. So we have the umbilical arteries, okay? So these are going to become 2 times medial umbilical ligaments, whereas the allantois/urachus, this will become your single median umbilical ligament. USMLE will ask you that straight up, okay? They'll mention one of these structures and they'll say, what will it become? Or they'll mention either the medial or median umbilical ligament, and then they'll say, what was it? And that's what you need to know. So another important structure for carrying nutrients to the embryo is the vitelline duct, which connects the yolk sac directly to the lumen of the midgut. This is normally obliterated during week 7, since the embryo is no longer receiving nutrients from the yolk sac, but sometimes abnormalities occur. If the duct does not close, the neonate will have a vitelline fistula, allowing meconium discharge from the umbilicus. Partial closure causes Meckel's diverticulum, which is an outpouching from the ileum that occurs in about 2% of the population and is generally asymptomatic, but can also cause symptoms such as rectal bleeding, pain, intestinal obstruction, volvulus, and intussusception. So the diverticulum can contain heterotopic gastric mucosa and or pancreatic tissue, which contributes to the bleeding. Different parts of the aortic arch and nearby vascular structures arise from different branchial arches. During the 5th week of development, the paired arteries and aortic sac, comprising the primitive circulation system, begin to fuse, sprout, and regress to form the adult vascular system. Now, the first arch develops into part of the maxillary artery. This is an interesting one because the USMLE loves to ask about epidural hematomas and the first arch. An epidural hematoma is due to what? It's laceration of the middle meningeal artery secondary to cranial trauma. Well, what artery does the middle meningeal branch off of? It's the maxillary artery. Get the point? So sometimes they'll show you a biconcave disc on a non-contrast CT of the head, which is evidence of an epidural hematoma, and you'd have to know that that is due to a laceration of the middle meningeal artery, and that branches off the maxillary artery, and they'll say which aortic arch is responsible for the development of the artery that gave rise to the artery damaged in this trauma, something along those lines. Okay? The second arch develops into the stapedial and hyoid arteries. For the USMLE, you need to be aware that the stapedial artery supplies the stapedius muscle. Now, what does the stapedius muscle do? It controls the stapes, which dampens loud sounds. Stapes is one of the middle ear bones, one of the ossicles. Now, cranial nerve 7 palsies can result in hyperacusis because the stapedius muscle is paralyzed. Okay? It's very high yield. The blood supply to the muscle that is paralyzed in cranial nerve 7 palsy, resulting in hyperacusis, equals the stapedial artery, equals a second arch derivative. The third arch forms the common carotid artery and the proximal part of the internal carotid artery. The fourth arch develops into different structures depending on the side of the body. On the left, it forms the aortic arch, and on the right, it forms the proximal part of the right subclavian artery. The fifth arch regresses and is absent in the sixth arch forms the proximal part of the pulmonary arteries, and on the left, the ductus arteriosus as well. Now, blood supplied to the right arm is dependent on a blood vessel derived from which aortic arch? Now, that would be the fourth arch, the right subclavian artery. Now, this isn't part of the flash quiz, but this might be helpful to review. Let's say we have a newborn who has a continuous machine-like murmur. Which aortic arch bears relevance here? Now, a continuous machine-like murmur in a newborn is classic for patent ductus arteriosus, and the ductus arteriosus is derived from the sixth arch.